Hello there. This is the fifth lecture, which goes along with Chapter 5 and Module 5. And here we want to talk about understanding consumer and business markets. Um, and the first part of this is understanding the the buyer's decision process. Um, the first part is obviously recognizing that there's a problem, and we don't necessarily think of it as a problem, but it might be some want or need. We realize we're hungry, or we feel the need for some type of product or service. And then next we start to search for information about how to fulfill that need. And in doing that, we will evaluate alternatives and ultimately make a purchase decision. And then after that, there is what we call post-decision behavior. And that may not seem very important to people, but there is a reason we pay attention to post-decision behavior. If people are satisfied with a product, we want to, we'd like them to tell us that and tell other people that. If they are dissatisfied with the product, you want to try to satisfy them if you can, because people who are dissatisfied with a product are about 5 to 10 times more likely to communicate their displeasure with the product to others, and that creates bad word of mouth. So in addition, we also want to establish better relationships with customers so that they will continue to be our customers, buy more products and more services, more goods. As we look at this decision process, we see that there are opportunities to interact with consumers and customers. Information search. Well, we must be able to provide information for customers to come in, to be in the results of a search, whether it's online or offline. We need to provide opportunities for people to evaluate our alternative, our product. This is why car dealerships give test drives. They want to help you evaluate very quickly. And purchase decisions often, this is where we maybe offer incentives to push people one way or another towards our product. There are various types of search behaviors, and we're back to a grid pattern here. Some are high involvement. These are products that require more thinking, more evaluation. Others are low involvement. And then we also have product types that some have major differences, and others have not much in the way of product differences. The first category here is complex buying behavior, and this is for products that are risky, expensive, purchased frequently, and tend to be highly expressive. What sort of products would these be? Things like computers, cars, fashion. Computers are both expensive and they're purchased infrequently. Cars can be risky if you get an unsafe car. They're also expensive. They're also highly self-expressive, as are fashions. People will take more time to evaluate fashion items because of the self-expressiveness to them. Then we also have what's called variety-seeking behavior. And this is for products that are the opposite. They're inexpensive, low risk, purchased frequently, and not necessarily particularly self-expressive. Things like candy, cookies, that sort of thing. If I were to ask you what your favorite candy bar is, you might say Snickers. Okay. Does that mean you always eat Snickers? Chances are you will occasionally try something else. You'll try M&Ms or a Baby Ruth bar or some other type of candy. And this is, for varieties, we like variety. And let's say there's a new candy bar in the vending machine and I decide to take a chance on it. It's not particularly risky. It's, what, $2 or something in that range. And if I make a mistake, well, I've only lost $2. I've not really risked very much. And so we have a lot of variety-seeking behavior in things that we purchase frequently and are not particularly high risk or particularly expensive. And these are probably, these two, complex buying behavior and variety-seeking behavior, I know they're mentioned in the textbook, and they're probably the most important. But we also have some other behaviors. One is called dissonance-reducing buying behavior. And that's for products, again, that are expensive, risky, purchased infrequently, and maybe highly expressive. A good example of this would be carpeting. Now, I've gone shopping for carpeting, and I didn't find it particularly pleasant because I just didn't want to make a mistake. I mean, almost every brand of carpet has a full range of colors, a full range of the lengths, shag, and all the different types of lengths and styles. You just didn't want to make a mistake. You want to reduce that worry because it is expensive and risky and so forth. The last is habitual buying behavior, and these again are for products that are inexpensive, low risk, purchased frequently, and not particularly self-expressive. And these are things we just buy without thinking very much about it. Things like salt and gasoline. You go to the store and buy salt, you just buy whatever brand you usually buy. Gasoline, similar thing. We just drive up to the pump. Now, with gasoline, we may look at the price, but for the most part, I know that, for instance, there are certain gas stations in my life that tend to have the lowest price, and I will pull up and tell them to fill up without really looking at the price. Just it's habit. So we have these various behaviors, and we need to be aware of, when we look at our product, what category does it fall into? We have talked previously about needs, wants, and demands, and I'm sure many of you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It was a theory developed by Abraham Maslow in 1959, and it comes in the form of a pyramid. Now, many of you will know that the first level is survival or physiological needs. For instance, if I were to drop you on a desert island, I don't mean a Club Med desert island, I mean a real deserted desert island. Your primary goals will be to find food and water and shelter, for physical survival. Most of us have met our physiological or survival needs. We don't necessarily have to go hunting and gathering. Instead, we can go to the supermarket, and we don't use bow and arrow or spears or traps. We use credit card or cash. So for the most part, in a modern society, survival needs or physiological needs are met through money, getting a job, getting pay that you can in turn buy, go hunting for your survival needs. The next level is safety or security. And this is a more long-term view. The types of products that you might buy, when I ask students what products do they think fall into this category, they usually tell me things like locks and security systems, guns, things like that. And that's absolutely true, but also things like life insurance and medical insurance. You don't need them when you buy them, but you're thinking, for the future, you want to be secure in the future. This is why many of you are in college. I will tell you a secret, don't tell the dean this, but you don't actually need to get a college degree to survive. Then why are you taking college courses? Because you're smart and you're intelligent, you understand that there is a competitive job market out there generally, and you know that you want that edge. You want to have the higher education, maybe you want the degree, you want to be in a better position relative to your competitors. And so a college degree meets a security and safety need. Next comes belonging. We are very social creatures. If, for instance, God forbid that you were ever in prison and then you committed a crime, what would they do to you? They can't put you in prison, you're already there. they would put you in solitary confinement. I always thought that if I was ever in prison, that I'd want to go straight to solitary confinement. I want to stay away from all those other criminals. But actually, solitary confinement is a cruel punishment. We are social creatures. We like to interact with other people. I think we all know that. Again, this is June 2020, where we're in at some point in the pandemic. I'm not sure we're at the end of it, but we certainly hope we're at the end. And we have felt isolated, and people have violated various guidelines, to get together because they have social needs. These social needs can be romantic or platonic. We like to. Many of you are members of clubs of some sort. Many of you are members of athletic teams, which are often for social. People often do that for social reasons. Religions are often very social groups. If you think about it, you can certainly worship or pray by yourself. You don't actually need to be in a group, although people feel more comfortable doing it that way in many cases. Many years ago, when I left the corporate world, I became a consultant, and I worked out of my home. Actually, this very office that you see here. And my wife would go off to her job. My kids would go off to school. My wife would go to her job. My kids would go to the school, and I'd be here by myself day after day. And I'm not somebody who generally requires a lot of social interaction. I don't mind being by myself in general. However, day after day, I started to feel that a little, and I rationalized that what I need to do is I need to go out and network. Even though I had plenty of clients at the time, I felt I should go out and network, and I rationalized it as a security thing, because you keep no client forever. And I joined one particular group. And this is sort of a little bit of career advice. If you join a networking group, go to the center of the group. Don't stay around the edges. The true benefits are if you go to the center, you become known. People get to know you. Generally, as a rule, if I join a group, I'm usually on the board within a year, or I have some leadership position in a year, because that's where the advantage is. Because you want to get people to know you. Anyway. There's this one group I joined, and within a year I was on the board, and we're having a board meeting, and it's very social. We're conducting business, but it's very relaxed, and we're talking about what we're doing in other parts of our life. And this one woman, Melanie, who was also on the board, she was telling us about the volunteer work she was doing for her church, which I thought rather odd, because I was pretty sure that Melanie was an atheist. She had expressed those views previously. And so I started to develop a little cognitive dissonance. How can somebody who's not religious be doing volunteer work for her church? So after the meeting, I went out into the parking lot, and I caught up with Melanie. I said, Melanie, you're an atheist, right? I said, oh yes, I don't believe in that God stuff. Okay, then why are you doing volunteer work for your church? And she said, well, I just like the feeling of community, and no cognitive dissonance in her. She actually, she just wanted to be part of a community, and it was meeting that need for belonging. And that's a lot, and actually she wasn't so much interested in the worship aspect. Actually, it's interesting. I bumped into her years later, and she had actually become a minister. This is for the Universalist Unitarians, and apparently you don't actually have to believe in a particular faith or set of dogma for that. I don't think that she really was that interested in preaching. She was more interested in officiating in ceremonies, or maybe I shouldn't speak for her, but anyway. And this just goes to the desire to belong. And if you think about all the products that people buy to belong, If you're going out on a date, you want to dress a little nicer. So fashion is often purchased with an eye towards belonging to a group or being social. Same with fragrances. Think of, again, all the clubs, even dating sites. If you think of various dating sites, and I'm not a big expert on these, but Tinder and um, Christian Mingle and eHarmony. There's one called Farmers Only. It's for people who are farmers, and I get that they live in a certain type of culture, and it's probably better for them to connect that way, and a whole bunch of others. I could list a whole group of them. Anyway, our next level is status or ego. If I were to bump into you on the street 5 to 10 years from now, you've graduated, and we recognize each other, and hi, how you doing, that sort of thing. My question would be, what would be some concrete things that I could see that would tell me that you're being successful, that would give you a certain amount of status? Those might be things like the way you dress. You might be dressing more successfully, fancier clothes. Maybe you have a really nice car. Maybe you have a title, at some company. Maybe you're executive director or vice president or something like that. Maybe you are, maybe you have a big house. Maybe you live in a certain neighborhood. There are a whole bunch of other of status symbols that are out there, both socially and professionally. Things like rank. If you're in the military, do you want to be a corporal or a colonel? Well, colonel certainly has a lot more status to it. In business, again, titles. Do you want to be a worker, a supervisor, a manager, a director, executive director, vice president, and so forth. There is in business something that's sort of iconic that a lot of people aspire to. It's called the corner office. People say, someday I'm going to have the corner office. And I try to ask students, why did they, what is so special about the corner office? There's offices of various sizes. I remember when I worked in the corporate world, I had a 2-window office, which was sort of the basic size. My boss had a 3-window office, and then a 4-window office. And his boss had a 4-window office, and then above that was the people who had corner offices. And the reason the corner office is so iconic and so special is that it is kind of nice, but also it is exclusive. If you think of a rectangular building, there's only 4 corner offices. There is a limited supply. While we can manufacture, 2, 3, or 4-window offices, but you can actually move walls in most buildings. Exclusivity, being parts of a club, and so forth, are all great status symbols. Excuse me. For the last thing, I'm going to I'm going to talk about self-actualization. And self-actualization is doing something for oneself. It is a personal thing. You've met all these other needs. For instance, let's play sort of do a mind experiment, a thought experiment. Let's say I take this pencil and it's going to be a magic wand. Poof, congratulations, you now have $10 billion. And so my question is, what would you do? Now, let's let a little time go by. I assume that you will take care of your family. You will pay off debts. You will, I assume most of you are good people. You'll donate to charity. You'll do some traveling. So let's let a year go by. You've taken care of all of that. All your other needs are taken care of. Certainly your physiological needs, security. You could put the $10 billion in a low interest savings account and live quite nicely off of the interest. So you don't have to worry about, you're secure. Belonging, you will certainly belong. Everyone will want to be your friend. You will have long lost relatives calling just to say hello. All the status symbols you can buy. You could, get the house, the clothes, all those things. Maybe even certain titles you might be able to procure. So the question is, what are you going to do now? And you do it. These are things that you would do for yourself. And excuse me. Give you an example of a situation I encountered. At one college I used to teach at, I was actually fairly friendly with the college president, which is not typical. Most of your college professors are not, hanging out with the college president very much. And we didn't really hang out, but we were friendly. Part of that was enhanced by the fact that this college president had a son who wanted to be a chef. He was trying to decide what culinary school to go to. And my nephew was already a chef. He had gone to the Culinary Institute of America. He had worked in 3 of the top 5 restaurants in the country. Ones with Michelin stars and things like that. And the president's son was considering going to Culinary Institute of America, and I said, well, would you like me to hook him up with my nephew just to give him advice? And so we passed telephone numbers and emails, and I kind of left the young men to it. And a while later, it was the second week of the semester, and in the second week of the semester, there is a big food event, and this semester is hamburgers and hot dogs, so nothing that fantastic. But if it's a free food event, I'm pretty much there. So I waited in line, and I get to the front of the line, and who's flipping the burgers but the president of the college? I say, hey, Bill, I'll have 2 burgers. And then I notice he's wearing an apron that says the Culinary Institute of America on it. I said, oh, okay. I guess your son went to CIA, Culinary Institute of America. And he said, oh, no. He went to University of West Virginia, I think he said. I said, well, why are you wearing a CIA apron? He said, oh, well, I went there. I went there for an immersion course in souffles. Now, souffles are very difficult, so I guess, it's worth taking an immersion course. I think it was a weekend course in it. And now he wasn't doing this to get career training. They actually closed the college few years later, and he lost his job as I lost mine. And he just went on to another college like I did. He was just learning how to make souffles for himself. He just wanted to accomplish that. That was an accomplishment. And a lot of people will do that. They'll have hobbies that they will devote themselves to, particularly if they're not scrambling to earn a living. So here's my question. As we look at these 5 levels of need, which is the strongest motivator? Now, some of you will say survival. Some people might say self-actualization. People might pick other things. And actually, it's kind of a trick question. The real answer is whichever need is the lowest unfulfilled need, unmet need. We tend to work our way up. Now, I'll give myself as an example. Many years ago, I was working, again, I mentioned I worked in the pharmaceutical industry. I had a secure position. I was certainly surviving. I felt secure. I belonged. I had friends. I had a wife and 2 kids. I don't say I had a lot of status symbols, but I had my 2-window office, which I felt was better than having a cubicle. So I felt that had a certain status for how I wasn't particularly old at the time. So I didn't have, high status symbols, but what motivated me most was self-actualization. I wanted to do the things that nobody else was doing. I built our company's first website. This was back in the 90s, when not every company had a website. Any project that was not typical, where I had to do some training or I had to challenge myself to do it, that is what attracted me. That is what motivated me. Then we had a new CEO come in, A few months later, he called us all into a large room and he said, "We're closing the New Jersey office and we're moving down to Georgia. If you'd like to come with us, great. Otherwise, have a good life." And so I just learned that I was about to lose my job. For personal reasons, I didn't feel I could make the move to Georgia, even though I was asked. So I realized all of a sudden self-actualization was not my prime motivator. It was safety and security. I had a mortgage, I had a wife and kids. That became my focus. And around that time, I went to consulting and education, and I started working my way up. And at the first college I taught at, I was, working my way up, belonging and status symbols. I didn't have much in the way of status symbols, but I was motivated somewhat by self-actualization, and I wanted to design courses. I wanted to do those sorts of things. I was chair of the faculty committee and did a few other things that had status as well as were challenging myself. Um, and then the college closed, and it dropped back down to safety and security being my prime motivator. And this will happen to us. We always tend to move up. We strive to move to a higher level of need. Sometimes we fall back, sometimes not. So here's the question: why are we talking about this? Well, think about your product. What need does it fulfill? And I've given a few examples. Like medical insurance fulfills security needs. Clothing and fragrances fulfill belonging needs, and other products that are more exclusive perhaps fulfill status or ego needs. And obviously certain things fulfill self-actualization needs. I'll give you another example. Walt Disney World, in addition to having their theme parks, also has Disney School, where they have week-long immersion courses, like in things like filmmaking and animation. These are not vocational courses. These are not, to go on professionally. These are just for people to do it, for themselves. It motivates them to try to, satisfy their own personal needs, inner needs. So, think about what needs does your product fulfill, and that's where you need to focus. There are all sorts of influences on what makes people buy things. Do people have a certain perception of your product? They need a certain amount of exposure for this. They have to pay attention, and then they have to interpret it in a certain way. And this is an internal process that we all go through. We're always trying to kind of make sense of the world and trying to, evaluate. Also, we just spoke about motivations, needs. That is an internal influence. What do we determine is our strongest unmet need? Also, we have to learn. We learn behaviors, we learn cognitively, and that will affect us, what products we buy. What attitudes do we have about certain things? Are you a do-it-yourselfer, or are you someone who buys things off the shelf, or do you have things custom made? And these are attitudes that you have towards different products. What's your personality? What's your self-concept? How do you view yourself? And in viewing yourself, you usually view yourself with certain types of products, certain types of possessions, or certain types of experiences that you might want to purchase. How old you are will certainly affect the products you buy. The products that I buy today are not necessarily the type of products that I bought, 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Lifestyle, what kind of lifestyle do we have? And there's all sorts of, people have, some people like to go partying. That's their lifestyle. Other people are a little quieter and they like books. Other people are creators. They like to make things, sculptors or painters, and that's just part of their lifestyle. It's not necessarily their profession. So you look at the lifestyle of the buyer and how does that fit with your product. There are also external influences, situational influences, the physical environment you're in. If you're in a cold environment, people are going to buy heavy coats, things like that. What time of the day, what time of the year, that will also affect the products that you buy. What social influences are out there? What culture do you belong to, or subculture or co-culture do you belong to? And we notice that people in a certain, let's say, example, subculture, by subculture I don't mean it's in any way inferior. I just mean it's a smaller group. Um, Tend to buy certain types of products, to wear certain types of clothes, you know, and use these products and services and goods. Um, so that affects what social class you're in will also affect in the United. What social classes are they are various strata in society, often determined by wealth, by income, by other attitudes. In the United States, we have seven social classes. Um, there are the upper uppers, the top 1%. You may have heard the term, the 1%. Um, and they tend to be obviously very wealthy, high incomes, but they also tend to be a little bit conservative. I don't mean politically conservative, but I mean socially conservative. They're not flashy. Whereas the lower uppers are newer wealth, and they tend to flash it. You may have heard the term nouveau riche. They are usually flashier with their wealth than others. And there are five other classes, and these classes are relatively permanent. Now, people may move from one class to another, but they may, through personal awareness and with an intention to move from one class to another. But the classes themselves, think of it like a ladder. You can move from one rung to another, but the rungs don't move. What groups are you a member of? Now, these may be social groups, they may be professional groups, religious groups, community groups. They will also affect, those memberships will also affect products you buy and are attracted to. And also, you will be affected by opinion leaders. And we'll talk about opinion leaders at another time, but these are essentially people who have purchased a product, usually, and they will express their opinion about it, and people will look to them for their opinions. Um, and so that is also, we'll talk more about that when we talk about product adoption. And also gender roles. Traditionally, there have been, there's sort of the male role and the female role. Those over time have changed. They have evolved. They've become a little bit more porous. And now we are seeing in our society people talking about non-binary gender roles. And even before that happened, we were seeing them, change. Um, there was almost like a sort of a concrete wall between the gender roles, and men and women did very different things. Um, that wall started to melt, and men started to do things that women did, and women started to do things that men did. Uh, One example is World War II. Many of the men went off to be soldiers and sailors and Marines in the war, many women moved into the factories. And that was a major step forward for women's rights, because women now realized they were just as capable of doing these typically masculine jobs as the men were. And you may be familiar with the icon Rosie the Riveter, and that had a major influence over gender roles and gender relationships. And we have seen that evolve. Um, and we have seen a lot of other, and more recently, again, the breaking down of gender classifications. And I could go on for a while about that, but I don't claim to be an expert on it. So I'll let somebody else pontificate on that particular topic. But we are influenced by people of our own gender, um, and people in our cultures, and people in our various groups that we belong to, and they are all very legitimate and real external influences over us. Not that they're imposing it, but we take our cues, we evaluate, and we're affected by, I won't say peer pressure, but we do try to conform sometimes. Maybe we decide we want to do the opposite of conforming, but that's still affected by external influences. We've been talking mostly about consumers, human beings, but also there are business markets as well, organizational markets. And these are groups of organizational buyers. There are producers. These are people who produce, manufacture. It might be farmers who produce, and they produce products and services. Agriculture, manufacturing services, I just said. There are resellers, wholesalers, and retailers. You're all familiar with retailers, brick and mortar retailers as well as Amazon. And then wholesalers are sort of what is traditionally called the middlemen. People who will buy from manufacturers and then distribute to various retailers. And other types of organizations, governments, nonprofits, charities, schools, and these these are called organizational, or is sometimes called institutional markets. They're not, but they do use various all sorts of products. And there are all sorts of reasons for organizations to make purchases. The most obvious one is, like consumers, to consume the product. And if you think of an organization, and let's take the college as one such organization, what products do they purchase to consume? Well, paper, for tests and memos and things like that, computers, furniture, light bulbs, they are all using them. And then we also have for resale. Now, some people, when we talk about consumption by the organization, some people think, oh, well, what about textbooks? Textbooks are resold, so that comes into a different category. And if you think of a store, let's say like Macy's or Amazon, they purchase lots of products, but 99% of it is to be resold to another party. So that's a different category of purchasing. Excuse me. And then sometimes organizations will purchase products for integration into their own product. And we're talking about things like ingredients and components. For instance, I might buy a box of Duncan Hines cake mix. Let's say Duncan Hines chocolate cake mix. And it has many ingredients. But let's say I decide, oh, I don't really want it to be chocolate. So can I take the cocoa powder out? Not really. It would be very difficult to do. I need a chemistry set to do that. And I might not want what's left. But it has various ingredients: flour, sugar, baking soda, baking powder, the cocoa powder. So those are ingredients which are relatively non-separable. You cannot separate them from the rest, as opposed to products which use components, such as a computer. A computer has all sorts of components. It's got the keyboard, it's got its hard drive, it's got its processors and all sorts of chips and wires, and these are all components which can be taken out. And some people actually do this. They will upgrade their computer by removing components and putting in newer, better components. And so you will generally see this. For the most part, ingredients and components are not advertised to consumers. We don't know their names. Now, a notable exception would be Intel. Intel makes computer chips, sells them to computer companies, but they've taken a relatively unique way of marketing in that they have tried to sell them to the manufacturers, but they've also made consumers very aware, and they've said any computer manufacturer that uses our chips can put the Intel inside. And this computer that I'm speaking to you through now has an Intel inside sticker on it. That's unusual. Most sellers of ingredients or components don't necessarily market themselves to consumers. They market themselves to their customer, their institutional customer. Business structures or large organizational structures. tend to have fewer buyers, but those buyers tend to be larger. For instance, in your household, how many computers were purchased in the last year or two? I'm sure it'll be one or two, rarely more than that. However, how many do you think, let's say the college again, how many did they purchase? They purchased probably a lot more. They might have purchased 50 computers in a similar time period, or maybe even more. So these type of customers are fewer, but when they buy a lot more. So they're larger buyers. So for instance, there's about 100 million consumer households in the United States, but there's over a million businesses and organizations. Now, depending upon the product, question is the consumer market bigger or is the organizational market bigger? It would depend upon the product. But there's certainly far fewer businesses and organizations than there are individual consumers, but the organizations buy more. So when we look at these organizational markets, they are fewer customers, but they buy larger. So they also tend to be more geographically concentrated, and this may seem a little odd, but if you think about it, certain industries, take the wine industry in the United States, tends to be concentrated in California, particularly concentrated in the Napa and Sonoma Valley areas north of San Francisco. I'm not saying it's all there, but that's where it's primarily concentrated in California. If you look at the oil industry, it is concentrated mostly in Texas, and that's if we're looking for the cattle industry, that would be Texas, Oklahoma, and a few other states, generally central the United States, not exclusively, but there. The pig industry, I happen to know, is concentrated in 3 states. 4 states. The 3 that begin with the letter I: Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, and North Carolina. For the wine and oil industries, that is because the Sonoma and Napa Valleys have particularly good soil and climate for grapes. So it's the natural resource that concentrates it there. In a similar way, oil, there was a lot of oil discovered in Texas, around just over 100 years ago. And so the oil industry in the United States concentrated there. Now there's oil all over the world, but the headquarters tend to be in Texas because, like Texaco and, but anyway, they tend to be in that area because that's where the industry started out. Now, it might be interesting to you to know where the pharmaceutical industry is concentrated. It's actually concentrated in our very own New Jersey. This is not based on natural resources, however. This is based on intellectual resources. There are a lot of pharmaceutical scientists who live in New Jersey. And if you need pharmaceutical scientists, chemists and biologists, and microbiologists, and other types of scientists, you want to be where those scientists are. I said previously that I worked for a pharmaceutical company that moved to Georgia. About 400 of us were offered jobs to go down to Georgia, and out of those 400 people, only about 72 to 74 people actually went down, and they made the offer quite good. They were really wanted us to go down there. They made us a very sweet deal to go down. Still, majority didn't take it because they knew if something went wrong in Georgia, they'd be in Georgia, and there's not a lot of pharmaceutical organizations down there. However, they knew if they were in New Jersey, there were a whole bunch of pharmaceutical companies, and they would be much easier for them to get a job. And so a lot of people did that. Actually, I know of a handful of people who went down to Georgia, left the company, and moved back to New Jersey because that's where the jobs are. So for various reasons, industries tend to be geographically concentrated. For instance, even a subset of the pharmaceutical industry, the biotech industry, is actually concentrated in the Princeton area. Um, I'm sure that has something to do with Princeton University, but there it is. So that makes it easier to deploy sales forces. I mentioned a moment ago the pork industry is in 4 states, and guess how many sales reps we had to go after that industry? We had 4, one for each state. It made things very simple. Also, it's important to understand that the demand for business products is derived from consumer demand. Yes, I may work for a company that makes a product that we sell to other companies, so we're not selling to consumers. And maybe they are making a product that is sold to other businesses, but eventually you'll come across a company that sells to consumers. And ultimately, without proper consumer demand, there will be no business demand. Because ultimately we sell, everyone sells to people who sell to consumers. I don't know how many generations apart, but so when consumer demand goes down, the economy in general goes down. When consumer demand goes up, the economy in general goes up. Also, it's important to understand that in large organizations, large businesses, business purchases tend to involve more buyers, more individuals. For instance, there will always be a key decision maker, that one person who will give you the thumbs up or the thumbs down on the sale. And it's often quite difficult to find that person, but often, but they're there. Now, I'm going to take an example. Let's say we're selling executive jets, like Gulfstreams or Learjets, those jets that are used by executives. They're smaller because these people tend to not like to fly commercially. Who would the key decision maker be? Let's say it might be, the CEO. That makes sense. Now, not every key decision goes to the CEO, but since it's an executive jet, this person will give the final thumbs up or thumbs down. But they will not be the only person involved. There will be many key influencers, in fact, probably multiple key influencers. In the case of this jet, certainly someone in the financial department, the finance department will decide, will influence the CEO, saying, yeah, we have plenty of money, or we don't have enough money. Maybe somebody in the public relations area. Let's say, we've had a couple bad quarters. Do we really want to be seen getting an executive jet? In fact, there was a case about 10 years ago when, over 10 years ago, I think, when the US government was considering a bailout package for the automotive companies in the United States. And of course, they had hearings, and each CEO flew in from Detroit. And they were asked, how did you get here today? Well, I flew. How did you fly? A jet? Was it a commercial jet? No. Was it a personal corporate jet? Yes. Okay. And how much did it cost? I think it cost like $40,000. I think that's the figure somebody meant. But even if it was just 20,000, that's a lot of money. And each one of them, and of course, some members of Congress raked them over the coals for that. It was a PR nightmare, public relations nightmare. Somebody said what they should have done is they should have carpooled in a hybrid and driven from Detroit to Washington. So you might, your PR manager or PR vice president might have something to say about that. Perhaps if you have a company pilot, they would have an influence over you. They might say, hey, yes, I love this Gulfstream, but I don't like the way it handles in bad weather. I have no idea. I don't know if Gulfstreams how they handle in bad weather, but I'm making a hypothetical scenario there. If you're the CEO and your pilot says, I don't like the way it handles in bad weather, you're probably going to listen to that pilot. They're going to have an influence over you. Somebody else who might have an influence over you would be your spouse. A lot of CEOs travel with spouses. In fact, in many companies, the spouse will have a significant influence over the key decision maker. I remember I worked for a production company many years ago. The owner was a guy named Frank, and his wife Liz also worked in the studio. And I warned everyone who I hired, don't piss off Liz. If Liz doesn't like you, you're going to be out. I know of another case where at an ad agency, they presented the campaign to the head of the company, the key decision maker, and the key, I think it was the president of the company, and he said, "I liked it. I think let me take it home and think about it." And he showed it to his wife, who didn't like it for some reason, and all of a sudden the campaign was dead. So never underestimate the power of a spouse, their influence. In addition, you will often have what are called gatekeepers. These are people who control access to the key decision makers. The most stereotypical and most obvious example of this would be the secretary. Now, secretaries often get they're not treated very well often. They're often underrated. Many of them are really like managers. And I've always treated any secretary with great respect because I know they're a gatekeeper. I mean, they deserve respect anyway, but I'll give you a perfect example there's a movie called Wall Street. It starred Charlie Sheen and Michael Douglas. Charlie Sheen plays a character named Bud Fox. He's a stock salesman. He is cold calling all day, every day, realizing that he's getting nowhere. So he decides to put extra work into going after a whale. And by whale, I mean a high value potential customer. And he chooses this gentleman named Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas. And he calls every morning and speaks to a secretary. I think her name was Dolores. I'm not sure about that. And he said, "May I speak with Mr. Gekko?" And she says, "Who are you?" And I'm Bud Fox. I'm with this company as well. Mr. Gekko doesn't speak with stock salesmen. He only speaks with investment bankers. And he calls every morning, gets nowhere. Turns out on Gordon Gekko's birthday, he actually shows up in person with a box of Cuban cigars. And he says, "Dolores, you're as beautiful as you sound." And she's going, who are you?" "It's Bud Fox. We talk every morning. And I just brought a birthday gift for Gordon. And, wondering if maybe you can give it to him and maybe I could get 5 minutes with him." So she goes in and he gets his 5 minutes. Until this point, Gordon Gekko, the decision maker, has never even heard of this guy because the gatekeeper, Dolores, was doing her job to keep people out. And this, for salespeople, can be a big challenge. And there are lots of gatekeepers that are not necessarily secretaries. Anyway, moving on. In addition, sometimes the key decision maker often is not the CEO, but they still have to go get approvals from somebody up ahead who will give a rubber stamp or something like that. And if that's the case, if as a salesperson or a marketer, you want to give them every bit of ammunition they can to get that approval. They're already on your side, you've sold them on it, but they have to still get somebody to rubber stamp it, and you're not going to get to meet with that person. So again, you want to consider that. In various companies, they have things called grants of authority. How much can you actually buy on your own authority? And if you don't have that grant of authority, you have to go up to a higher person who has that grant of authority. In general, with large organizations, you're going to see much more of a professional purchasing effort. There are often purchasing departments where you'll have specialists, and these are highly knowledgeable buyers. These are people, and they usually specialize. Somebody might specialize in buying advertising and promotional services. Somebody might specialize in buying office supplies. Somebody else in engineering parts. Um, Again, depending what business the company is in, um, they will have specialists. So they're more knowledgeable buyers, and they also are very skilled at negotiating. Um, Years ago, we were in a situation, our vice presidents in the company decided they wanted to hire a global ad agency. And we chose J. Walter Thompson, which is a venerable agency out of New York, but they had global offices. And we engaged with them. And our CEO the president decided he wanted to bring in somebody from our parent company's purchasing office to come in and negotiate for us. He wanted to get the best value. So he brought in this gentleman named John. And John was really tough. He was a tough negotiator, and he was brutal. Actually, we kind of were a little bit embarrassed by him. He was the hired gun. You've heard of good cop, bad cop. He was definitely bad cop. He was tough. He yelled at them and said, you're paying too much for rent. Why should we subsidize your rent? And he had a lot of analytics that he threw at them. And he was amazing. He did get them down to about half their price. And but he was hated and despised by the agency because of it. And actually, we were embarrassed by him. So the agency and we and the agency actually bonded over how much we hated John. But after the negotiations were done, John went away. And that is probably a good way to handle it. If we had done that negotiating, even if we could have done it as well, it would have poisoned the relationship. So, and you'll often see procurement departments or purchasing departments engage that type of strategy. And you have to deal with that. A little postscript to that story I just told, actually what the agency started to do was they started to rotate people out of, the people they had on our account, they started to rotate them out. And so instead of getting the A team, we ended up getting the B or C team. And that was a way to come, so when you negotiate too hard, you can maybe not get exactly what you want. There are, in the corporate world or in large organizations, there's the decision process, and most decisions are complex buying decisions. Even there, if it's simple things like pencils, because you might be buying 10,000 pencils for a large organization, or pens, or what other supplies, and you will be looking for the best price. I remember actually working at one organization. It was actually getting difficult to get paper because our chief financial officer was decided to do the negotiating, was really squeezing suppliers and getting the best paper prices. And for a while we were working without very much paper. Nowadays, it's not as much problem because everyone works on computers more than they did then, but still. Processes are more formalized. There are purchase orders and requests for proposals and things like that. And often there are bidding requirements. It is not uncommon for an organizational buyer, to require at least 3 bidders and then review those bids. There are internal grants of authority. I think I mentioned this earlier. At one company, I had a $25,000 grant of authority. That meant I could purchase up to $25,000 worth of goods or services. Not that it would be unchallenged, but I mean, I could do it under my authority. It would still be checked later on. If I wanted to buy more, I would have to get a signature from somebody higher up. Now, of course, there are ways to get around this too. If I was buying, let's say, $30,000 worth of something, I might have them send 2 invoices of $15,000 each, and that's sort of sneaky way around it, and you can't do that too much, but that stuff happens. In general, when you're dealing with large organizations, you want to build relationships with them. You don't want it to be just transactional. You want to go from being adversaries in a negotiation to being partners, and that's very important. And I know of a number of salespeople who've done that. I specifically remember one who was servicing a medical clinic. He again worked for a pharmaceutical company, and he particularly worked on vaccines, and vaccines have to be refrigerated. And so they gave him permission to come in anytime to do an inventory of their vaccines in their refrigerator, write up the order, and just order the vaccines. Now that's an extraordinary amount of trust. You're allowing the salesperson to determine what you're going to get. Now, here's the potential problem. If that salesperson decided to take advantage of that, that could be, if they ended up with too much vaccine, then he would lose that trust and not be able to do that. I had a similar relationship with one particular client. The person, the key decision maker for me, said anytime I wanted to come, fly into town to meet with people in the company, I had carte blanche to do that. Now, I didn't do that very often because I felt it was important not to abuse that trust. But anytime I flew into town, that meant I made more money. So there's that. A lot of companies engage in what's called supplier development. If they are sophisticated enough, they will try to find suppliers who can help them and actually help those companies be more successful because they want reliable suppliers. And I've seen a number of seminars on this, been to a number of seminars on this, where large companies bring in their suppliers and talk to them about how can they do business to better together. How can they each make more money? Now, obviously, the larger customers are trying to subtly squeeze their suppliers, their vendors, but they're also trying to make it work better. And this is not a completely new area, but a new area that has been developing for the last couple of decades with a lot of focus on supply chain management. And we'll talk more about this later in the course. But the idea is, how can we move goods from the manufacturer to the end user as smoothly as possible with as little added cost as possible, and to do it on time, and to reduce stockouts and other inconveniences, and how to maximize fuel costs for shipping and things like that. And we will talk more about that when we talk more about distribution. At some of these seminars I've been to, and I've been to a number of them, and I'm surprised how much they echo what each other is saying. There are certain minimum requirements for a supplier. First is assurance of supply. They have to be able to supply that good or service as needed on a regular schedule or on demand, and they need to know that that supplier will always have their back, will always have the supply of product for them. It needs to be an acceptable cost. Usually they want the lowest cost, but not necessarily the lowest cost, because sometimes if you push for the lowest cost, you get an inferior product, or it compromises other things. When I was a corporate buyer, and I wasn't a big corporate buyer, but when I would buy various services, I didn't try to squeeze my vendors too much, because I wanted them to always be available to me. I would buy services, let's say like video production services or something like that. When I didn't have a lot of money, I would say, I'll make it up to you on the next project, and I made sure I did. That is, of course, a line that is used a lot. Cut me a break today, and I'll give it. You'll make it back another day, and that is often a false promise. I try to always to fulfill that promise, and I would encourage other people to do. And this has to do with ethics, and also, again, assurance of supply. The quality of the product, and both in terms of the level of quality as well as the consistency of quality. Yes, you can always get a lower price, but you're usually getting lower quality. So it has to be established what quality, and consistency is really important there. In addition, most preferred suppliers must also supply a certain amount of service. You know, call people back quickly, deliver, go above and beyond whenever you can. And also a certain amount of creativity and innovation. Being a consistent supplier of old technology isn't going to make you a preferred supplier. You need to innovate. You need to stay on top of things. I think I gave an example earlier in the course of the travel agency that was being squeezed on price, and they decided to innovate and be creative by saying that they would manage their video conferencing system. And that was, I think, a very smart move on their point, and that's a great example of creativity and innovation. So there are some business buying trends, and the trends are always changing, particularly now as we are in the middle of a pandemic. And this is something that's not new at all, but the outsourcing of traditionally in-house services. For instance, this one goes back a long ways. Very few companies actually maintain their own cafeteria. If they have a cafeteria, it is, they outsource that because unless you're in the cafeteria business or the food service business, that's not your core competency. So why not outsource it? Other areas you're seeing being outsourced, things like IT support. I'm talking about larger organizations. And I remember that actually the company that I worked for that went to Georgia, I did go down as a consultant. And I saw my friend Sherry there from the IT department. I said, "Hey, Sherry, how you doing?" And she said, "Great, I don't work here anymore." I go, "What do you mean? What are you talking about? We're standing in the middle of the corporate headquarters. What do you mean you don't work here anymore?" I said, "Well, I work for IBM now." The company outsourced all their IT support to IBM. In an exchange, the IBM had to absorb the IT people that were already here. And that meant that if Sherry or somebody else left, IBM could put a new person in very quickly, and they'd always make sure that these people were trained and they were at the top of their game. Other areas, manufacturing is more and more outsourced. It used to be that, example, the Ford Motor Company made sure it produced everything it needed. It used to actually own rubber plantations to make tires for its cars. That today would seem completely ridiculous. They would go to a tire company and do that. Even I know one company that actually outsourced its research. These are called CROs, contract research organizations. Some companies will outsource their Salesforce. There's Salesforce.com, and there's almost nothing. There's very little that you can't outsource. Certainly, legal services. I mean, even large companies that have a legal department will still outsource part of their legal, work. In fact, I had one client who actually their corporate headquarters consisted of 5 people. They had outsourced almost everything in the company, and so their corporate headquarters was a place in Pennsylvania that had just 4 offices. For the president, the chief research person, the chief regulatory person, and I think a couple others. Another thing we see are reverse auctions. I am sure you're all familiar with an auction, how it works. You let's say this is the product that you're bidding on. You bid $2, somebody else bids $4, and the idea is the price goes higher and higher and higher. Reverse auction is when you want to buy something, and I actually had a friend who was at another company who managed reverse auctions. And what he did was they would put out a specification list of everything they wanted. The specs were very important because you didn't want somebody offering you something inferior. So it had to be the minimum specs, minimum specifications that would have to be offered. And they would put it on a website, and they would actually have a website that would accept bids. And apparently it was a 3-day process. I mean, they let all their suppliers know ahead of time. And he would ignore it for 3 days. He really only paid attention in the last hour, because everyone figured out ahead of time how low they could actually go, and they would want to go as slow as possible. But when it got close to the deadline, they would actually, and he said he could watch it dropping, by the minute. And so that is another purchasing technique that is used. Globalization, having your suppliers be anywhere on the planet, is certainly something that is probably not new to you. We talked previously about trade, and components and ingredients may come from all over the world. That means you're now competing with a larger group of companies, firms, which drives down prices, hopefully helps quality, all the things we talked about being the advantages of free trade. However, sometimes there's also a counter trend towards regional buying, and that is because some people realized that they were going too far. They were shipping things from too great a distance, and sometimes there are problems. Now we've actually encountered that with the pandemic. A lot of companies have just realized that they're getting their goods from China and nothing's being produced in the United States, and their production inputs are coming from China or other areas. And there's been a big push, at least with the rhetoric, to make sure that we manufacture more inside the United States. And that's a type of regional buying. I mean, if it was in Canada, it probably wouldn't be a problem either, or Mexico. But the farther you stretch your supply lines, the more easily they can be cut. And so there is some concern about that. So globalization is still very strong, but there is kind of a step back from that a little bit. We've actually seen this also on a smaller scale, the growing popularity of green markets, where people will bring produce and other agricultural products to a town 1 or 2 days a week. And people are pushing towards local sourcing of food products. And that's kind of an extension on a local scale of this. We've also seen in the last couple decades an increase in online buying. Used to in the business-to-business sector, selling to organizations and businesses. That makes a lot of sense. People are doing that, again, based on relationships. But why do I need to call a sales rep in every time I want to buy, or call somebody? I'll just do it online. And that was actually one of General Electric's early epiphanies. They realized they weren't going to be able to sell a lot of stuff to consumers online, but they could buy from their vendors online, and that there was a real savings there. And generally, more emphasis on supply chain management. How do we transmit goods faster, quicker, cheaper, more efficiently? It's funny, years ago when I was at one pharmaceutical company, I was speaking to somebody in manufacturing, and I had a minor idea for reducing costs. And the person kind of said, no, I don't think so. We make a lot of money on these products. Nobody's giving us any pressure to reduce the manufacturing costs. Well, then, of course, competition became heavier, and a decade later, I'm seeing these same people, squirm and try to cut every penny from it. So I guess my idea was like 10 years too early. I don't even remember what it was, but it was, not a huge idea, but I just thought a little way to save a little money, and there's just no interest. Now you're seeing people trying to cut every penny out of the distribution system, out of the manufacturing system. And if you, as a supplier, can do that, that will be an advantage. Okay, obviously you can't ask me any questions, but you can ask, we can't ask me any questions here because it's a recorded video, but you can email me any questions, and I wish you the best of luck, and take care.